Hello everyone, this is Dennis Williams. Welcome to Meaning in History. And today I'm answering student questions about technology in the ancient and medieval world. So there are a set of questions that students have asked after reading in the textbook about technology in the ancient medieval world. And one of the questions that they asked, which I found a fascinating question, is how does innovation and invention of new technologies actually happen? And how did people come up with new technologies? How did they develop this innovative approach to things? And that's something I've thought about for quite a long time because I have a strength called ideation, in which I really love to get involved about in thinking about new ways of doing things, new ideas, new whatever, just like letting my imagination run wild. And I really like doing that with other people as well. And so I've been thinking about this idea about how people come up with new ideas. And so there have been some explanations that people have had in the past about how that happens. One of those explanations is that we ourselves are too limited to be able to really do that, and so new ideas come from outside of the human being. They come from like a muse, a spirit from the outside that sits kind of on your shoulder and whispers in your ear, something from the mind of God, perhaps. And that even goes back to, the idea that Socrates, that Greek philosopher, had, that as he went through life, he was constantly sort of struck by these ideas, and he really believed that it was from, this being from the outside that connected him with the larger spiritual world that gave him access to that. And so, the idea of genius, people who have this, remarkable, innovative vision for, something that knowledge or able to put things together really differently. That notion of genius connects really with a word that you might be familiar with, which is the genie, right? So that outside spiritual being that whispers in your ear. Now, I think there's probably, some value in thinking about ideas coming from outside of oneself, but I also think that the human being is wired up in ways to imagine worlds that don't exist currently. And we talked about that early in the semester, before we all, started doing things virtually. But, early in the semester we talked about, the human brain and how it actually works, and how humans, better than any other species apparently, is able to think about the world, imagine it as being different than what it is, and then using tools and language to collaborate with to actually change the existing world into something that approximates what one imagined. And so human beings, maybe because it's of our visual cortex, our big frontal cortex of our brain, whatever goes on in that in sort of the structure of the brain that allows that to happen. But humans have an amazing capacity to imagine something that doesn't exist. So you think about that. If we can imagine a world that doesn't exist, and then we start to work on recreating or creating that the world in a way that it conforms to our imagination, we also would be able to think like, how could I, like right now I have to use maybe I'm going way back into prehistory, but I bang these rocks together and I get this one to chip, and that's going to give me a little bit of an edge, maybe to scrape some hides or something like that. But what if I could? And that what if question drives that imagination to think about doing things in new and different ways. And so that's a part of it. Another part of it is being able to take existing technology and improve on it, make it one step better. And those little innovative improvements then lead to technological innovation. And there's also a kind of using technology by analogy, which is, so over here we use technology in a particular way, but I wonder what would happen if we actually brought that technology or the way we do things, that process, and brought it into a completely different arena. An example of that from a more modern perspective is the development of the assembly line by Henry Ford in the manufacture of automobiles in the late 19th century. One of the things that Ford did is he said it'd be great if the men didn't have to go to the car and carry all the stuff to it, but instead the car came to the men, like it happens when bags of flour are filled up in the mill, and then a conveyor belt brings them along, and then the person sews them up, and then they go on down the line so that somebody can load it onto the wagon or whatever. And Ford was able to see that that piece of process technology happening in the flour milling industry, and then apply it to manufacturing cars, which enabled him to make manufacture cars much less expensively. So, oftentimes we're thinking about, well, I do this here. Well, what if I could just use it over here? And I might have to adapt my tool a little bit to do that. And so that leads to technological innovation as well. Another thing that leads to technological innovation is communication. So we're able to speak, we're able to write, we're able to use language to take the ideas that are in our head and communicate them to another person. Well, so in that situation, if we can talk to one another, we can also exchange ideas about tools that we have, about technologies. And that's particularly important when we start having cross-cultural communication. When there's a diverse group of people who have lots of different ideas and they talk to one another, then they begin to develop together new ways of doing things and imagining new tools, which then become those technologies. And when there are extensive trade routes so that people far away can actually come and say, you know what, in my country we do it like this. Or I was visiting a country on this trading expedition that I was on, and there they have this really interesting piece of tool where they did it like this. And here's kind of what it looked like. And as a result of that, technological innovation happens in different parts of the world. I think we mentioned last time in the question and answers about something about the wheel, I think, at least in one of my previous videos, and how the wheel was a powerful piece of technology in the old world, in Europe and Asia and Africa, but it was a piece of technology that didn't get imagined and wasn't developed by the time people had migrated to the Americas. And as a result, the wheel was never developed as a piece of technology in the Americas. And so, the ability to move ideas across the landscape becomes a powerful force in the development of innovation and technology. One of the other things that I think happens with regard to technological innovation is just our ability to do trial and error. So people come along and they try something and maybe it doesn't work, but they observe what they did and they say, well, I could maybe do that differently and maybe get a little different result. And so they try something different and they observe and they reflect on it, and that trial and error and observation and reflection, when you cycle that over and over and over again and are persistent, you keep at it, well, that leads to lots of innovation, lots of new technology. And I think probably we can look to somebody like Thomas Edison, who described it really well, as he worked with trying to figure out how to make the filament of a light bulb in the late 19th century. And he said, I haven't failed in all of these different experiments that I've had. I've actually succeeded in learning what doesn't work. And, that's a modern example, but certainly the execution of trying things, seeing how well they work or how well they don't work, trying new things, experimentation, that's something that went way back into human history, and we see examples of that throughout the human experience, particularly in areas of like combining different things that the alchemists were attempting to do. They want to, for example, turn lead into gold. Okay, well that's neat, maybe, but as they imagine how could we go about doing that, they learned all kinds of things, because they never turned lead into gold, but they, through experimentation, learned to transform lots of different chemicals into different kinds of chemicals, or that had different properties, and that just became the roots of this sort of scientific approach, this scientific method of develop a hypothesis and then test it and then see what's real, see what's a fact or not. And that's significant in the ability to develop and change and make new technologies. And I probably can't emphasize too much that cross-cultural change that happens in many parts of the world, so that as Mongols and Turks and others come out of the Caucasus region of Asia and move across into Europe, they bring with them some technologies that they had, for instance, the stirrup. And they also bring the sort of harnesses that had been developed in China as well. And Europeans see these things and go, "Wow, we could do that." And the stirrup and the horse collar and all of those types of things which had been developed elsewhere and come to Europe lead to a radical transformation in the development of, the um, development of warfare, for instance. When people can sit on a horse in a saddle and have their feet in the stirrups and sort of lock themselves in and don't have to worry about sort of falling off or being dismounted, then you develop the knight. Who's heavily armored and has the lance and goes jousting and all of those sorts of things, and the control of the horse gets much easier because one can shift one's weight without falling off the horse. And so, those types of things which come across, from Asia, radically transform not just the technology that Europeans use, but radically transform their behaviors, their ways of doing things. So one of the questions was, how fast did technologies change? How fast did it happen? And I would say that, the answer to that would be much slower than today, because technological innovation relies upon the exchange of ideas between people having lots of different perspectives. And so population density matters. There's a sort of a physicist by the name of West, maybe it's Alan West, who wrote a book about this, which essentially said that you get 1 million people together in a place, and and innovation happens at a much higher pace than if you only have 1,000 people. And again, part of that's because 1,000 people are probably spending a lot more time just surviving. There's not as much specialization that goes on in a community of 1,000 as there is in a community of 1 million. So there's that kind of thing, but also it's just all those minds working differently certainly contribute to technology and innovation happening at a much faster clip. In the ancient medieval world, there aren't that many people on the earth, okay, as there certainly are today, and they certainly didn't live in those huge concentrations like they do today. And there were other barriers to communication as well. Communication was very physical, sort of face to face, or limited because you could write it down. But before the early modern period, there wasn't a printing press, and so you had to copy books by hand, and so that really limited how many books there were available, how many whatever were available, and how far they went. So books were made out of vellum, which was a kind of sheepskin that had been prepared, and so that was also pretty costly. So you don't want to produce a whole bunch of those. And so that lack of communication means that technology changes much more slowly. Innovation happens much less quickly. And people may have great ideas but not have the ability to put them into practice because they actually have to work on feeding themselves by farming or something. And as a result of that, that innovation is lost. That imagination is stymied because there aren't enough resources to be able to allow them to flourish. And so those are some interesting aspects of how innovation happens, how people come up with new ideas, and how rapidly or not so much rapidly technology developed in the ancient and medieval world. One of the other questions was a question related to gender and technology. And I think this came out of your reading, in which there was a whole section on Chinese women as weavers and in the Song Dynasty period. And so why was that? Well, I think Carolyn Merchant, who is a historian, an environmental historian, women's historian, technology historian, talked about it in terms of women and men have a fundamental difference that shapes their behaviors, or what the limits of their behaviors oftentimes, and that is the issue of reproduction. So, men oftentimes are involved in production processes, taking nature and making it do things, and women can do that, and certainly do that as well. But women also have the job of reproducing the species. And so because they give birth to children, and because those children, are pretty clingy for the first couple of years at least, because of breastfeeding and those kinds of things. As a result of that, women tend to be sort of locked into a place as they take care of children. And as they give birth over and over and over again because of the lack of effective contraceptives and things like that, large family sizes, women pretty much are locked into a place called home. And so the technologies they use are technologies that are sedentary, that are situated in the place. So the man becomes free to go out of the home and work the fields or the forests or the seas or whatever it is. Women saddled with that childcare responsibility are going to be more local, and so weaving technologies and those kinds of things become just part and parcel of the woman's experience. A little bit later on in the modern period, Carolyn Merchant would say that men tended to innovate and create labor-saving devices that mostly saved men labor. And so, whereas the medieval farm would have had women and men working together, the crops come off, and if the you take the child and sort of sit them at the end of the field, and women and men harvested the crops together. They brought them in together. The men cut the wood and brought it into the house to feed the fire and stoke the stove and all those kinds of things. And women may have cooked, but certainly men cooked as well. Baking and all of those sorts of things were not gendered in the same way. But over time, as new technologies developed, it was like, oh well, let's make the stove really efficient so we don't have to feed it as much wood. Oh well, who does that save labor? Well, that saves men's labor more than it saves women's labor, because men typically were more out in the forest cutting the wood or mining the coal. Not that women didn't mine coal too, but it happened in those ways. And so Carolyn Merchant would argue that there is in the development of technology, there's a definite shift to save men's labor over women's labor. And so I do think technology has a kind of a gendered consequence in some ways, and certainly as we go into the modern period. Last question that I want to take up, somebody asked, what were the detrimental effects of technology? And I just want to bring up two of those. And a little bit later, you're going to read about environmental history. But I want to point out that technology does oftentimes have a negative consequence on environmental systems, because human technologies have been aimed, particularly in the ancient medieval period, at getting more production out of nature. And so, cut down the trees, plow up new fields, and so the forest disappears and it turns into fields, so that humans can harvest the produce of those fields. And so that takes these mature forests and turns them into forbs, which are annual, plants that just grow once a year, and then the landscape is denuded and maybe erodes, and things like that certainly happen. We see all kinds of examples through time of the degradation of landscapes, and agricultural technological innovation allows people to cut and farm much larger expanses of land in response to the growth in population and the demand for food, the demand for wood to feed fires and all of those sorts of things. And so you see a shift in the shape of the landscape that comes about and is made possible by increasing development of technologies to harvest forests and to convert land into farmland. And so that has a negative effect on forests, certainly. I would also want to point out that technology also leads to an increase in the efficiency of killing, particularly in war. So I mentioned a little bit ago about the stirrup. And so, once you get mounted knights who are riding horses and able to stay seated in the saddle with the help of the stirrup, it changes the character of war. And so that now you have, foot-mounted soldiers, or soldiers who have to dismount because they rode a horse in, or rode a cart in or a chariot in, but to actually go to battle, they have to jump out of the chariot and get on the ground and actually fight it out. Um, that changes the tactics of war, so that now armies clash, but then knights provide this sort of cavalry function where they ride in and disrupt the battle, and so there are elements to that. The development of metal tools and the use of those tools increasingly in combat means that things get deadlier. Armoring up with the development of metals as well. In the Middle Ages, the development of new military technologies in the form of crossbows, longbows, the use of gunpowder then, and how gunpowder, which was not a military tool in China, does become a military tool in Europe, and that technology allows for certainly a much higher death rate in combat in short order, and efficiency, and makes war an arms race, right? A technology race to see who can have the most efficient ability to kill the other side, so that maybe fewer men participating in battle can kill more men later on. And we certainly see that in the modern period as technology begins to become capable of creating mass casualties in ways that it hadn't been able to do in previous years. So does technology? Technology is not always good, right? Technology can certainly have a negative effect as well, and benefits on one side, detriments on the other side. But that is the nature of it, I think, and we see that certainly in our own day to day. Well, hey, thank you so much for watching this all the way through. If you like the content, please subscribe, click the like button, all those things that everybody on YouTube says. Go ahead and do that. Also, next time we're going to be talking a little bit about conflict that happens between core civilization areas and people who live on the periphery. So send in your questions about that, and I'll be happy to address them. So thank you so much for being here again, and over and out.